So thank you again, everyone, for coming. I just want to introduce myself. I'm Maria Maria Davis, teaching faculty at the University of Regina, and I'm coming to you from Treaty 4 territory. And I would like to respectfully acknowledge the Nahiiwuk, Anishinaabe, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and Métis people on whose lands I live and work. These lands have seen thousands of years of rich Indigenous history, but also cultural cleansing and genocide that follows to this day. These atrocities are felt to this day with the systemic barriers and historical exclusion of Indigenous peoples in academia. My personal journey to reconciliation and decolonization, in this journey, I seek out ways to make academia and STEM accessible and inclusive. And I'm really excited to learn about the ways of making the content accessible to all of our students with today's session. And so I'm really delighted to introduce to you our speakers, Isaac Mulolani and Laura Ambrose. Isaac is the manager of Open Education and Publishing Program at the University of Regina with over 18 years of experience teaching in higher education. Isaac has extensive experience with using open source tools to design learning activities, which have been included in the creation of the open educational resources. Laura is an instructor at Luther College, where she teaches introductory biology to majors and non-majors. Laura aims to provide the skills students need to be successful in university classes, as well as teach students foundational knowledge in biology. Laura's goal is to deliver online and in-class learning experiences for the diversity of students that enter her classrooms. And with that, I will pass it on to you, Isaac and Laura. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. I'm just going to share my screen. We have a presentation, and we've made this presentation available. And I think Maria will talk about that at the end, along with some handouts. So I'm just going to, these are the topics that we're going to cover today. So we're going to just go through a definition of OER, talk about licensing, attribution, sustainable goals, social justice, OER and accessibility, what materials constitute OER, the benefits of OER, which I think will be interesting, how you can create and adapt, tools for creating OER and where you can find them, and then how to select OER, and then just a little bit more information on these UN Sustainable Development Goals. So as you've heard, both of us are at the University of Regina. Laura is at Luther College. So I'm going to start off and just give you a definition of OER. I have two of them here. One is from the Wiki Educator. The other one is from Hewlett Foundation. The key thing is these are freely accessible, openly licensed digital assets. So they're digital, usually digital, but they can be provided as hard copies as well. And when we talk about freely accessible, one of the big things is we have the open license, which allows one or more or all of these 5 R's. We call them the 5 R's. So either to retain, reuse, revise, remix, redistribute. So the license that is posted on an open educational resource allows you to either do a subset of these or all of these. And that's where the power comes in. So here's the Creative Commons licenses as well as the public domain license. The public domain license is right at the top there. And the bottom two, so these are ranked in order of, as you go down, they become less open. And the bottom two are the most restrictive. And actually, strictly speaking, they are not OER because you cannot remix. The equal sign there basically tells you no derivatives. That means you cannot remix these, you cannot adapt them. You have to just use them as is. And in this table, you can see that in the column here, it tells you what you're allowed to do with this. And the column here tells you what you're not allowed to do, right? So this is a very simple little graphic. And I think you have a copy of this as one of the handouts. The other thing is when we use OER, we need to be able to attribute to the whoever it is. So there's the way in which we attribute is the title, author, source, license. So the title, who authored this? What's the name of this? Who's the author, and where can you find it? And then the license, of course, tells you how you can use it. So I've given you some examples here. We have the faculty guide for evaluating open resources, and if here it's by BC OER librarians, and the source for it is here, just an URL. Sometimes the URL goes along with this. And then, of course, the license. So there's examples, fairly straightforward. One of the things that is a big issue today in Canada, because Universities Canada, which most of the universities across Canada are subscribed to, is pushing for the UN Sustainable Development Goals to be one of the things that the universities across Canada push through their communities. And there are two of them in particular that apply to education. The first one being quality education, ensuring inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. Some of the things that are being used, some of the strategies being used to do that are universal design for learning, accessibility, the EDI that we're all aware of, and inclusive teaching practices. The other one is the ensuring sustainable consumption and production patterns. So of course, because these are digital resources, one of the things that we do away with is the need to use paper, which is a big thing. And then we're also looking at reusing these resources, so sustaining the usage of OER. One of the things that other people use is renewable assignments, so you're reusing your assignments, and then flexible learning options, which are a growing thing. So social justice is connected with OER in the sense that you can see here. We've got three different aspects of social justice: redistributive justice, recognitive justice, and representational justice. And you can just read from the table there. Of course, one of the very first one is we're trying to make sure that everyone can access the learning by making these open resources freely available to people. But then, of course, in the middle there, we want these images to be accessible to people represented by the diversity of cultures and persons in the society that we live in: Indigenous people, people of color, international students, people from different cultural backgrounds, from different countries in the world. So, we have ways in which the OER, when they're created, we have rubrics to try to ensure that they are as representative as possible. And the other thing is, of course, giving voice to marginalized voices. For example, trying to get Indigenous people to create OER and have their voices as part of the OER community. When we talk about accessibility, usually we just put this in here because I wanted to just make a note of the accessible nature of these resources. This POUR is one of the things that comes from the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Can all students at least perceive the content? Are all students able to navigate and interact with content? Are they all able to understand? And does it work well with other technologies? These are the basic concepts that we try to make sure that OER meet these criteria. So what materials constitute OER? It's not just textbooks. So as you can see here, it's like courses, videos, presentations, syllabi, manuals, quizzes, images, a whole range of different things that constitute OER. And on the right, you can see there why we would choose to use OER: academic freedom, attract students, co-creation with students when we get into open pedagogy, cost savings, enhancing quality, reduce preparation time, collaboration. And I actually have specific benefits for faculty. I think the first two are kind of important, as well as the very last one, because of course, in academic circles, we want to be able to maintain academic freedom. OER allow you to actually look at your course and adapt the content that you're going to use as your if you're talking about the textbook, to what you want to deliver for the students. So the license allows you to take, let's say, a course in biology, and let's say if a certain chapter doesn't quite meet what you want, you can go in there, rework that, because the license allows it, to what you want to teach in your class. So that becomes really important. And then, of course, for students, of course, the biggest things are the first three: cost savings, all of them being able to access the content, so it being accessible to all students across ability levels and across the diversity of students, and of course, impacting their success. So generally, when people are creating OER, what is it that they need? What is it that they need to be aware of, or who do they need to work with? And I've just listed here some of the people that can be useful if you want to create an OER. So if you are a subject matter expert, which most of you are, you can bring in an instructional designer to help you, librarian. You can have students. In the University of Regina, we have grants, and the grants pay for students, graphic designers, copy editors that they can bring in to help them with the projects. So it's always useful to sort of leverage, pre-existing content instead of trying to start from scratch, because there's a lot of OER out there, and depending on the license, you may be able to reuse, start from whatever is there and then build upon what already exists, which is what we're always working towards that. So some of the tools that can be used to create OER: Microsoft Office. I've put at the bottom there some other options like Pressbox. There is the Pressbox version that is a paid subscription, which the University of Regina has, and I believe the University of Saskatchewan has, and a number of universities across Canada have this paid subscription. There's something called Softmaker Free Office, which is much, much cheaper than Microsoft Office. And then, because you're all science people, LaTeX tools are also there. There's LaTeX tools, and I've got at the bottom, you can see there's things like the Context, Tech Live, those things. And then there's a free version, an open source version of Pressbooks, which can be used as well. And now, Laura.
There you go. Okay. I wasn't quite prepared. I was listening too intently. Okay, so I just, hello everyone. It's very nice to be here today. I want to thank Maria and Nicole and Isaac for giving me this opportunity to speak today. And also, I always love opportunities to spend time thinking about what I do and why I do it. So this was great too. Just a little bit about my background in teaching here at post-secondary. It kind of follows the same path probably that a lot of people follow, at least in terms of the resources that we use for teaching. So for example, when I first started teaching, I had a proprietary textbook, and because I started teaching like 2 decades ago, a big stack of proprietary transparencies with images from the textbook, and that's what I use for teaching. I actually was quite unsatisfied with this process early on, and I spent a lot of time with like myself and instructional designers trying to find a way to make that really expensive textbook more useful to the students. But I felt like these were sometimes like just busy work, like trying to make them do something to go interact with the textbook. So then as my textbook, so it's a most commonly taught course is a single semester non-majors biology course. And so that textbook was becoming more and more expensive for students. And then there would have little resale value after a couple of years. So what I did is actually redesign my whole course and included all of the content I wanted them to learn within the lectures and the lab. So I saw it as a whole and put it all together. And that textbook took a back seat to what we would learn in lecture and what they would do in lab. That kind of evolved into actually just writing things myself. And then at the same time all of that was going on, I was developing a fully online lab course. So fully online lab course, you need a lot of online digital resources. So I found a lot of OER that I actually still use today. And because I kind of wrote that whole course myself, it sort of made sense to then share it with all the other people in the province who are teaching a similar course. So I was doing that before I even knew there was a name for doing that, just sharing. So now I use a lot more OER. And it's what we're going to see when I show you some is on that table that Isaac showed with all the different licenses and what you can do and can't do. It kind of like is the whole spectrum of the resources that I use. And it's just what I've used and I find that works. Okay, so this first slide is like a list of OER, open educational resource repositories. So it's not exhaustive at all. There are, oh wait, maybe we're not on that slide yet. I don't know where we are. I realized I'm actually looking at my, there we go. I'm looking at my own version of the presentation and I didn't advance it. There we go. So it's not an exhaustive list at all, but it is a solid list of really useful repositories. So I will talk a little bit more about how to start looking for OER resources. And generally it's not like just picking these and clicking on them because you might find yourself emerging from a rabbit hole like days later. So I'll try to sort of streamline the process that I use a little bit. But I do have a few repositories I'd like to point out. The first one is at the top, OpenStax from Rice University. So this is from Texas. So when you first look at it, it appears to just be a textbook repository, but just like what Isaac was saying with BC Open Campus, it's more than that. It's a repository for a lot of OER resources. The textbooks are open source and peer reviewed, and they fit into the licensing where you can adapt them and change them and add to them and add assessments, things like that. They cover a lot of areas, so science, a lot of science, but then also business and social sciences as well. One of the things I really like about OpenStax is they often have different versions of the same textbook. And so I use a biology textbook that has been written for non-majors. So it kind of already streamlines the book a little bit for what I use. They also create what they call cartridges. So these are the plugins that can go with our learning management systems. So Canvas, Moodle, D2L, those kinds of things. The next one I want to point out is the BC Open Textbook Collection. So again, this is a little bit poorly named for what it actually is now. They started with the goal to make higher education more affordable and accessible, and it grew out of their very extensive online education program. It's a really interesting repository because it includes resources for universities, colleges, and applied institutes. So, you know, it's there for everybody and everything that they need. There is an organizational focus on equity, diversity, and inclusion. So, and this shows up in the resources that they have. And they actively encourage development of OER. One of the things I found when I was kind of poking around was an actual Canadian edition of the book that I use. And so they have changed some of the content to have a more Canadian focus and created new interactive resources for it as well. So that's kind of like right there, OER, just go do it, you've got it. And then one more resource I want to point out here is the PhET simulations. If you see partway down the list, it's PhET. So it started as physics, education, technology. I don't know, is it science or are we just like, we don't like to rename things because these simulations are by far not only physics anymore. It includes math and other sciences, including biology. So simulations, I don't know, like when I was in university, simulations were like, what do I click on next? But the simulations here are actually very well supported for both in the classroom or lab use for the instructors and for the students. So there's a little bit less, where do I click kind of thing. So on the next slide, there's a whole list of repositories there. So I just went through a few of them just to kind of highlight what they do. But these are some sources that I use in my biology classes and labs. The first one on the list there is called the National Center for Case Study Teaching in Science. Case studies are like the stories we tell, the examples we give in lectures and in labs about why do we even care about this content that we learned? What is the point of it? So the case study repository was its own thing at the University of Buffalo, but recently it was acquired by the National Science Teaching Association in the US. So it looks a little bit different. There is a small membership for instructors, but there is no fee for students. The membership fee came about partly, I think, in an effort to protect some of the like assessment answer keys more than it was trying to actually protect the copyright of the documents that were there. Copyright is maintained by the Center, National Center for Case Study Teaching and Science, but it's very adaptable for in-person and online teaching. So you can make changes, you can add assessments, you can make name changes, location changes, all those things that make it more useful to you in your teaching. Again, the case studies are well supported with teaching information, background information, and actually assessments. So the case studies are written by often instructors at universities and institutions around North America and around the world. It's North American centric, it really is, but it is expanding beyond North America. And there are resources in the repository on actually writing case studies. So how to write a successful case study. And then they are all peer reviewed. So last I saw is about a 15-month wait from submission to publication because of the peer review process. But that does mean that they are fairly robust case studies. The newer case studies follow some pretty good universal design for learning standards, and some of the old case studies are actually being rewritten. So for me, where I find that most useful are like in genetics case studies, where we're kind of moving a little bit away with our language and examples from what we used to have to what we would hopefully use now and in the future. So that's good. I use case studies in different ways, but one way I use them that has been really helpful is to just take snippets of the case study and create assessment questions and make those like extra credit, because in science we don't do that extra credit, but my students come from everywhere but science, so they kind of expect a little bit of extra credit kind of work, which I just call them engagement credit marks. And I give them these case studies, so it extends our foundation knowledge into applied. And so if they do the reading and answer the questions by thinking about it, you know, it's kind of like those extra credit marks they're looking for. The second two resources, number 2 and 3, are the Howard Hughes Medical Institute and BioInteractive. BioInteractive is actually part of HHMI. So if you maybe know about Howard Hughes and his eccentricities around science, but the institute was formed in 1953 as a research institute, but right from the beginning, it was about advancing knowledge, what they say, through research and science education. And this goes from elementary to post-secondary. So it's not just like, here's a few resources for grade 4. It's like all of it. It is they do have a strong commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion in their research funding model. And then the education materials come from their research. They go together. So it's quite robust. It's got a little bit of a different copyright formula. You're not going to go in and make changes to the videos. But they do have like the whole point of those resources is for educational purposes. one of the things that's really great about biointeractive is that they, again, just like OpenStax, recognize that some of what we are teaching is at that earlier level and some is more advanced. So they create resources for both of those. So you're not stuck trying to go, oh, just wait, just ignore that part. We're not taking those multiple syllable enzyme names in this class. One of the other things that I really appreciate about HHMI is the connection to the history of science. So how did we discover something and why do we even care that we know this? What is the point of it? How do we apply it? So those resources are quite good. I use them quite a lot in my lectures and in my labs. Now, the last one on there, I really like, Cells Alive. It's different than the other repositories. It was started by one person who really likes science and really gets photography and video. And so he's like put those together and he's created videos and animations and interactive animations. And he has this really nice repository of images and videos that you can use in lecture and lab, because when you're teaching, say, an online lab like we have been doing for the last 2 years, students are like, wait, what? It moves? You're like, well, yes, it's alive. Until now, you've probably only seen pictures, but here's a video of something in real life. And so he's just like really committed to this. So he started in 1994 and he's maintained it ever since then. So the way I use this one, so there tend to be smaller, shorter resources. You can't change them, but you probably wouldn't want to. So what I do is I put them in my class lectures, I use them in my online unit notes, but where they're really helpful is just like the other resources, not so much the case studies, but the resources from biointeractive as well. I put them into pre-lab activities so that students do the work with the resource before they come to in-person labs, and then to make them do it. They have to do an online quiz before they can come to lab. So it's creating sort of a sense that the resource is actually going to be useful to them in their learning. Okay, I'm taking up all the time with my excitement around those, but I have a few more things to talk about with OER. So on the next slide, we're going to break down like a checklist. We call a checklist for evaluating open education resources. And just like Isaac was saying, I'm not going to go through each point. I just have a few things to talk about for each one. The first thing I figured out a while ago was start with your course, like start with what you're trying to teach. Otherwise, you will get, there are so many resources out there that you could just get stuck watching something on, I don't know, quantum physics, but you teach biology. So while it might apply, it's not really, you're probably not bringing it into your class. So I always start with my course objectives, and I have some questions that I ask myself. Are there topics that students seem to have trouble with? So is it like, am I getting those same questions all the time, or something wrong all the time on an exam? Are there static diagrams that could be enhanced or replaced with animations or interactive animations? Do you need to add online resource to supplement in-person labs? So that's where I started using some of these OER resources for pre-lab work. So get students a little more interested in what they were doing before they came to lab. And then, like in the pandemic, do you actually need to move online? Like, do we need to go fully digital? And I actually sometimes forget that people use textbooks and all of that proprietary, all those proprietary resources that come along with that, because I haven't used them for so long. So some of these questions or points maybe would apply to those resources, but I'm speaking only about open educational resources. And they're definitely out there. So one of the other points about resources and relevance is whether or not the resources make the students think a little bit, or what we call like self-reflection or self-assessment. And what I found is that a lot of resources don't necessarily do that. but you can make that up yourself. So every resource I give them questions that direct them directly to the resource and what I want them to learn or think about. And then, of course, if you can find resources that include their primary sources, that makes it kind of what I sometimes call, like in my class, we don't do a lot of like science research in science literature because it's kind of beyond the scope of the course. But if you remind students that what they're using for these resources, they're not just something I made up out of my own head, they're based in science knowledge. So kind of what I call closes the circle a little bit of research. In the next slide, we talk a little bit about accuracy, and some of it kind of is obvious, like they should be free from error. And then using the resources that are appropriate for the students so it doesn't cause confusion, leading to them to misunderstanding the science. One of the things about accuracy is that some resources that are available started out as YouTube channels, and which is not necessarily a bad thing, but sometimes their focus was getting traction in that social media space. And so they can still be useful, but they can sometimes be, you kind of have to go through them carefully. However, when I say that, there are some institutions that have moved to YouTube to distribute their video resources. And so those are out there because YouTube is kind of maybe more robust than our own individual video servers. The next slide talks a little bit about production quality. And this is almost a moot point now because technology is so good for creating videos and animations. But there are some things out there that are not necessarily the best production quality. And so what that can actually do for students is increase confusion. And so we don't need that in our courses. We don't need any more confusion. We have enough of our own. But there are a few things to keep in mind that I've noticed is that some resources try to introduce too much like they call like graphic flashy things, the whoosh in and out. And while it can look good for a video or a resource, it actually detracts from the learning. And then some hosts, and Isaac and I have talked about this before, some hosts try to introduce too much humor or too many contemporary resources. And so, or references, sorry, not resources. And so that some students who maybe, just don't like pay attention to that or are not from a geographic region or a little bit older, a little bit younger, they don't get those references and it actually detracts from the whole resource entirely. So those are good, but sometimes not exactly what we're looking for. The next slide is about accessibility, and we've talked about accessibility already in the presentation. Talk about transcripts or captions. So we have captions for this presentation. You can get resources that come with transcripts and come with captioning, and those are really good. In some cases, I really like a resource and it really doesn't have anything accessible. So I've actually typed out a transcript, say from one of them was Radio Lab is a program from WNYC and National Public Radio in the US. It was so good. Those poor little Tasmanian devils and their facial tumors. It was like just the best thing. Students were like, this is so interesting. I never knew this existed, but it was just audio. And it was really hard, I found, for students, especially students without English as a first language, because it's a radio program. Like like just goes right on by. And they're not checking to see if anybody caught what they were saying. So that was one that I did my own transcripts for. And then the other thing I started doing was I have unit notes that are typed and I just started reading them into a microphone and posting those recordings. And I asked students, are they useful? And students were like, yeah, that was really good. There are other resources. This one isn't, I guess, I don't know where maybe Isaac knows, the Films on Demand database, I understand has a fairly extensive license fee for universities. But they allow you to show fairly common and popular films in university classes, and you can link to them and things like that. But one thing I like is they have like those old books with like audio and a book, and you read along. It has like live, I don't know what you call it, like it highlights words as they are spoken in the video. So that's like been really helpful. Students who have ADHD really like that option. So yeah. The next slide is about interactivity, because otherwise it just becomes another thing that students put on while they go do something else. And that's not what we want. So these are questions I ask myself about: why am I using this resource? What are the students going to do with it? Does it explain a concept? Is it just simply, here's a plasma membrane, here's a video about the plasma membrane? Does it make the student think about how the concept applies in their life? Does it introduce a topic in such a way that students begin to think more deeply? And then does it introduce a controversy, a complex problem, or transformational ideas to get students thinking about the topic that you're teaching in the context of society? So I teach another class on transformational ideas, and what I try to think about my resources beyond the ones that simply help me explain something is, can we find resources that help students say, wait, what? And then think about their own life or society that they live in to see, are we helping them move along the path to solving these complex or transformational problems? And then back to the other point I made is, sometimes if you don't have any interactivity that comes with the resource, just go ahead and make your own. And it becomes, like I said, one less thing for the students to say, oh, I have to read that thing or watch that thing, but who cares? I'll just put it on and go make craft dinner. The next slide is about licensing, and this is not my area of expertise with OER. And Isaac talked about it, and there are lots of resources that were posted there. So what I try to do with the resources that I'm using or looking for is start with organizations that are producing very robust resources. So where they have dedicated like that whole slide that Isaac had about who's involved in making OER, but organizations that are committed to all of that list. So providing everything that is needed. Now, some of those end up with resources you can't actually change yourself, but then you probably don't necessarily need to. And then some of the other resources, especially things like the case studies, where you want to contextualize it to your class or to your geographic location, those do, well, the ones I use anyway from the case study center, they do allow for you to make those changes. So the only thing I really think about licensing myself is learning what the licenses are. And if it's absolutely not going to work, then I just head on down the road and find a new resource. So I spent some time using those proprietary resources, and now I don't use any of them. And I don't necessarily think that they're any better than what I use, say, on the Howard Hughes Medical Institute or something like that. I think that was everything I had to say. And then the last slide here is again about sustainable development goals. And that slide earlier that was sustainable development goal 4 + 12, that's like a really super awesome combination. I have the sustainable development goals, to me, are like really big. Like the ideas behind them are just so broad. I just kind of take one at a time and look at it. So number 4 is on quality education. And from their website, they say, to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. So there are so many things in that statement. And so we need to, though, narrow those goals down to what can we do, because they're global goals, and I'm right here. So we can only do what we can do, but I keep them in mind as much as I can. So what I do to work towards this goal in my classes and labs is I increase accessibility by providing transcripts or captions as much as I can. So if it doesn't come with the resource, creating it myself or finding resources where that's like baked right into it. Including culturally diverse examples, references, and sources. So recognizing that some of what we know, especially in biology and human biology, comes from a fairly narrow set of data. Yeah, so just recognizing that and knowing we need to go beyond that and looking for people who are studying and use that data. And then think about writing it. Think about creating that OER that includes that culturally diverse data and examples. One of the things I found really interesting, I just want to bring up as the last point here, is the 2021 Sustainable Development Goals report indicates that the pandemic caused setbacks in almost all of the gains made in education from 2010 to 2019. So it has setbacks in reading proficiency and setbacks in school completion rates. So some of the things that students were getting in their schools, they were no longer getting, and that actually set them back substantially. So it's possible we're going to see these in our post-secondary classes in the future. So it's good to keep in mind, and these OER resources, these OER can actually, maybe mitigate some of those things. Just my last comments, because I wanted to end off on something, is that I think this is a really excellent time for the creation and implementation of open educational resources. The pandemic forced us to stop and think about what we're doing and why we're doing it, and then become better at teaching and learning in a digital environment. If you think about for 5 minutes all the things you've learned in the last 2 years, we can use that going forward. We've gone through the frustrations, so let's do the next step. Also technology options for creating content are much more accessible and easier to use than ever before. Even here at Luther College, we had an instructor who said, I want my students to make podcasts. So they simply went out and bought the equipment and made a sound booth. And it was like so much easier than anybody thought it was going to be, because the technology is so good and user-friendly. But then there's also a really strong social awareness around accessibility. It's no longer like, oh, those students over there, they need this special thing. The accessibility is good for everyone. And that social awareness means that there's more support than there has ever been before. Okay, that's it. Oh, I didn't realize I was so passionate about that.
Thank you so much, Laura and Isaac. And I have put in the chat the folder that Laura and Isaac created for us with a lot of resources. I meant to share it earlier, but then once you got talking, I got so interested in what you were saying. So yeah, we're open now for questions. If you have any questions for Laura and Isaac specifically with respect to what they've said, or other questions, regarding their experiences. I see there's been a lot of conversation in chat, which I also seem to have missed. Yeah, please go ahead with questions. Yes, there is a lot of information, and I think that really understanding what licensing resource has, I guess, is something that's really important to understand. And you talked about very different types of resources, like the HHMI and and sometimes being on YouTube. Is there a spot on YouTube or on these websites that you can find easily the licensing parts, that whether or not we can reuse it or it's copyrighted? I guess I'll ask my own question to begin.
Well, one of the things is to make sure that you're aware of what the most common open educational licenses are. The Creative Commons ones, but they're not the only ones. There's also the open source licenses. So for example, at the University of Regina, there is one professor in Campion College. He uses the new free documentation license on his resources because, and I understand this from an open source perspective, because for open source users, the key thing is providing the source for your whatever you've given, whether it's software or a document. So that's what he uses. But the Creative Commons licenses, if you go to, I think there's creativecommons.org, they have a full explanation of all the 6 Creative Commons licenses. Inside the Google Doc that Maria shared, there is an actual newsletter that the University of Regina Open Educational Resources Program put together. And one of the documents, one of the articles in there actually shows you the different licenses, the 6 different licenses. And so you just need to know what they mean, and which I did mention in the presentation that the ND basically is not good if you want to be able to adapt and remix. So you're looking at the other 4. And so the other 4, there's attribution, there's, we can, well, if you look at the document that's in there, or I can actually show you on the presentation, all you need to know is does the license allow you to actually, if you want to be able to adapt? So if it's an ND, then no, it won't let you adapt. And any of the other ones, I'll just show you on my screen here. I have it up on my screen. So you can see these 2 licenses at the bottom here, the non-commercial and the other one, the ND, both of them, they do not allow you to adapt. So essentially, really, strictly speaking, they are not open educational resources. These ones up here from the public domain, plus the 4 CC licenses, they allow you to adapt. And so what you're looking for when you're looking at a resource is one of these little icons on the resource, because they tell you what you're allowed to do, right? So all of the licenses, like when I created my document, right at the top, I put this. And in the Google somewhere, there should be the source for this document, which means that somebody could take this presentation and reuse it, right? So whenever something is CC licensed, then what they need to do is put one of the icons that represents the license that they've chosen onto their resource. And that will tell you what you need, like what you can do with the resource. So I think the most important thing is the ND. When you see the ND, if you have no problem using the document as is, then you can reuse that, but you cannot adapt.
Great, thank you for that. And I suppose the other question I have is, if we do make something, like I make one with my students, how do I go about getting the license, or is it just automatically licensed? How does that work?
Well, you are the people that are actually creating it. So, well, there's 2 things. Actually, the students have to agree to, having their work in the public, right? And then you determine the license, because this is you who are going to actually decide what kind of access you're going to give other people to your resource. So you're the ones that are going to determine, okay, what should our license be? For example, recently, a justice studies professor and 10 of his students created a resource. And that resource is now they use Pressbox for that. So the students wrote papers and then put those papers into Pressbox. And then we uploaded that, and that document, that whole resource is available under the license that they chose. I'm trying to remember what license they chose. It is CC by attribution, the same license that I have well, let me actually show you so you can actually see it. Where are we? Oops. So can you all see my screen? So this is the resource that we just released last month, edited by the professor, and they had copy editor edit all of the student papers after they'd been checked by the professor and his colleagues. And there's the license. So you have to actually clearly state what your license is, and you will pick the license. So you're the one determining what rights you're going to give to anybody who wants to use your resource.
Thank you, Isaac. Joe?
Yeah, I've just got a question. I'm really curious to hear either Isaac or Laura what your experiences are, or your, I guess, thoughts on maximizing reusability and ensuring that things can be remixed and sort of used however an educator wants, but balancing that with actual discoverability, because many of the academic platforms where we can host OERs aren't actually that findable unless you kind of already know they're there, and that could sort of pose a bit of an accessibility challenge. So, you know, what do you think about posting videos on YouTube which may not be strictly speaking an OER but are freely available? Or I don't know, just sort of putting that thought out there. Have you guys considered that at all, or what are the best practices?
Well, I will speak from my point of view as somebody who works with faculty who are creating content. We have Pressbox as one tool, one platform that can be used. And so I will just share my screen here to show you. Pressbox has something called the Pressbox directory. And the Pressbox directory is where you can actually search for Pressbooks that have been created around the globe, wherever people are using Pressbooks. So you were talking basically about metadata. And so when people in the University of Regina are creating OER, for example, that resource that I showed you earlier that was released last month, one of the things that I spoke with the faculty member about was making sure that there was sufficient metadata provided so that when this is posted in the Pressbox directory, it's discoverable. So you can see here, there's very few, there's a few items in the metadata. There's no summary here. Same thing here. Again here. So the more information you provide, the better chances somebody has of discovering your resource in, for example, the Pressbox directory. And so the metadata become really important. In fact, last year, the Pressbox people were actually, they'd send out some emails to all the people with Pressbox resources talking about this very important aspect, that please try to make sure people put as much information on their resources as possible so that others can discover it. So that is an important thing, because as you can see here, we still have resources that have very little in there. And then you'll have resources like this that have a lot, right? So this is what we want. We want the more information you can provide in the metadata, the more discoverable your resource is. So.
Thank you, Isaac. Matt?
So thank you to the speakers today for all of the information. The question that came up for me was, there was just an example, I think, Isaac, that you had up of a remix of students' work attached to a course and with a faculty member. and you're talking about the licensing for it. Can you comment at all about what the faculty member and the process needs to go through to make sure that the students' IP and licensing acknowledgements are accumulated as part of that? So I don't even know where to start with some of those ideas that have sort of come up here about what we're even trying to collect from the students in terms of, do they approve or not approve, and then how do we keep track of that sort of tombstone information from them to make sure that they're properly captured?
The resource that I showed you is the second one that's been created at the University of Regina. The first one was a history resource by one of the professors in the history department. And so what he got his students to give, of course, assent to the fact that they would publish their papers in Pressbox, and those resources will be, their papers will be visible to, well, the world, essentially. So one of the things that I'm actually looking to actually implement is actually to get, because of course, like you mentioned, there is the student consent. I have some documentation where actually students can actually sign, and then they can also have some input as to what license is going to be. But of course, you have to explain that to them, right? So what you would do is talk with the students and ask them, okay, so this is what we can have as an option for something for you to do for your course, right? To apply your knowledge. When I was actually a number of years ago, there was a professor out in the East Coast at St. Mary's University, and what he had done is he was writing a book with students. And students were working in groups on chapters of that book. It was a book in, I think it was some kind of, some area of mathematics. And he was doing it in a cumulative way. So one year he had these group of students, and the next year he was going to use the next group of students to actually cumulatively add to that. But I think the big issue is that the students need to be recognized. So here I will show you the history professor's work that was published in 2010 in December. So you can see here, this is the history book. And you can see on the book, the professor wrote the introduction, and the students are acknowledged as the authors of the individual sections. And at the back, there's also a listing of the contributors. Each of the students are listed here. And then if you go to the metadata that we provided here, it's very specifically categorized that the authors are the students, and then the faculty members, the editor. So just being very clear on what exactly will happen. I actually went to this class and the professor allowed me to go in and speak to the class before, they were in the process of actually working on things. And I described what was going to happen. And they were all okay with it, and they were excited about it because, of course, they had something that, is published now. So I think just being able to explain to them exactly what will happen, that they will write, if you're doing something like this, for example, they write a paper, you check the papers, and then they will be authors on their respective paper, and their document, their resource in its entirety will be available under a specific license for everybody else to see. So I think just being clear is, I think, what I've gotten from both these faculty members is the students were all on board. In actual fact, the students for the first resource that was published last month, there's 3 of them that are going to be giving a presentation along with their faculty member next month, actually, on the work that they did.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you. Laura, before I move to you, just quickly say we are on the hour, so if you have to leave, thank you for coming. I will just put in chat the link to the CSM 2022 conference that's going to be held in June from the 26th to the 29th, and we, CMUE, will be hosting phone, and we have a keynote speaker, and we will announce that soon. But if you have to leave, thank you so much for coming, but we're here, we're gonna stay for a few minutes too. So Laura, please take the floor.
Sure. I just have one question, Isaac, about, it goes back to the idea of discoverability. Do you know if our Pressbox publications automatically appear in the library search results?
No, they're not part of the library. Like we have a link that connects to the library, and the library has a link that connects to Pressbox. But the library isn't part of the Pressbox repository. Like if you go to the Pressbox directory, all of the resources that appear there are the resources that are in the Pressbox networks, global networks, right? So if you want to specifically, like there's some resources, if people want to put them in the library as well, they can do that. But usually they just provide links to the Pressbox actually.
So the results might get, see, I'm just wondering if someone went to their library to search for the topics, like the new book that Brenda Anderson put out in Pressbox. So somebody's looking for missing and murdered Indigenous women, and that might show up on their results, but then they have to go to Pressbox to get it, or if it doesn't even appear in the catalog at all.
Yeah, because the library actually has people who are aware. So they have librarians embedded within the departments, and those librarians are actually aware of the OER. So if you, for example, ask about that resource, the librarians will know where it is and they'll give you the link, right? But they have, I'm not sure about this, but one of the things that they do every year, they publish a list of the people who have, people across the university who have published resources. One of the things I'm not clear on is whether they're listing all the published books or just the ones published through UR Press and elsewhere, because I haven't seen the ones that we've put through the Pressbox. For example, Brenda's wasn't on the most recent document that they had released. So it's not clear to me. Right.
So it's the idea that we have one catalog maybe in the world for OER that's not connected to other catalogs. So maybe that's a thing for the future.
Yeah, for me, what would be useful is all of the books that are published through Pressbox in like, for example, in the University of Regina, they should appear also along with the other ones. They can categorize them and say, these are OER that were published this year, but they should still be there as so that people are aware, right? But usually what I do is I'll actually, every time there's a completion, I will send out an announcement, right? And it goes across the networks as well, but an announcement internally to the university community. But the library should also, the library does keep tabs on everything that's published because we have to ask for ISBN numbers. So they actually know when something is published because we get ISBN numbers from the library. So I know somehow they keep tabs on it, but they're not including it in all of the lists that they put out every year. I don't know why. Maybe we need to have a conversation about that. Actually, if you do a search, Joe asked a question about Pressbox being discoverable in a Google search. If you do a search on, let's see, justice studies, you can find actually Pressbox by doing a search through Google. You can actually find them. That's actually what I do. Just before this morning, I was actually I was responding in a part of a chat, and I quickly wanted to find the BC Campus's, one of the resources from BC Campus. So I just went into Google and put the title in, and I think it was the third hit. It was the BC Campus resource. So it will give you, as long as you know what the title is, it will come up. And again, the metadata becomes the important thing, right?
That's great to know. And thank you so much, Isaac and Laura, for doing this. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your days on busy days to come in and talk to us about this.
Well, thank you for having us. I'm hoping that the materials, the handouts, and the presentation will be something that people can refer to and find useful in what they're doing. Joe, do you have a question, or it was just?
Oh, that was just clapping.
Oh, okay.
No question.
Okay. Right.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think I will stop the recording now, and I will share this recording and as well as the resources again via email.
Yeah. One of the things I probably should have mentioned was in the use of YouTube in Pressbox tends to be a little bit problematic because of the changing of the links. When the links change, then your Pressbox link will change. It'll be broken, actually. So one of the things that we try to avoid that by asking, for example, Brenda Anderson and the resources that are being developed right now, when they create video, what we try to get them to do is to put them in the media server of the institution and then embed from there or link from there. Because if you link from YouTube links change, and whenever the YouTube links change, you'll have a broken link in your resource, which is a problem. Because when one of the neat things about Pressbooks is, for example, if somebody wants to reuse that Pressbook that the Justice Studies professor had, they can clone an exact copy. Let's say somebody at the East Coast at one of the universities in Atlantic Canada wanted to reuse that resource. They can make an exact copy in the Atlantic OER Pressbook instance out in the East Coast of the resource so that they have it in their local resource, and then they can reuse it. Or they can add to it, right? Because that's what the license allows you. They can have students adding to that resource to increase the number of articles in there. And let's say from 10, you can have maybe 20, add 10 more. And that ability to be able to copy is good, but if links are broken, then you have to go looking for the new source for that particular video. So if they use the link that's from the institutional media server, you won't get broken links unless somebody takes all those videos out. So the links will remain the same. So that's the challenge with institutions putting videos on YouTube. YouTube links are constantly changing. That's the problem.